Pollination. Introduction. Flower anatomy. Flowers are composed of many distinct components: sepals, petals, stamens, carpels. These components are arranged in whorls and attached to an area called the receptacle at the end of the stem that leads to the flower. This stem is called the peduncle. In case of an inflorescence where multiple florets are produced in a place of a single flower, the stems leading to the florets are called pedicels. Whorls. Flowers are composed of sets of highly modified leaves arranged in whorls. The outermost whorl of a flower is called the calyx and is composed of sepals. Inside the calyx is the corolla, which is composed of petals. The sepals are often smaller and less colorful than the petals. The calyx and corolla are called perianth. Reproductive parts: androecium and gynoecium. Inside the perianth, the androecium, a whorl composed of stamen. Each stamen has a long filament holding up pollen sacs called anthers. Inside the androecious is the gynoecium, which is composed of carpels. Each carpel has an ovary at the base where ovules are housed. The style emerges from the ovary and is topped by the stigma. Pollen grains land on the stigma and must grow a tube down the style to reach the ovule and complete fertilization. Pollen transfer. Flowers must rely on vectors to move pollen. These vectors can include wind, water, birds, insects, butterflies, and other animals that visit flowers. We call animal or insects that transfer pollen from plant to plant as pollinators. Pollination is usually the unintended consequence of an animal's activity on a flower. The pollinator is often eating or collecting pollen for its protein and other nutritional characteristics, or it is sipping nectar from the flower when pollen grains attach themselves to the animal's body. When the animal visits another flower for the same reason, pollen can fall off onto the flower stigma and may result in successful pollination of the flower. The pollinating agencies are classified into abiotic and biotic. Abiotic includes wind and water. Biotic includes insects, birds, bats, snails, ants, etc. Abiotic agencies. Anemophily, wind. It is a mode of cross-pollination or transfer of pollen grains through the agency of wind. Example: coconut palm, date palm, maize, etc. Characteristics: the flowers are colorless, odorless, and nectarless. Pollen grains are light, small, and winged, or dusty, dry, smooth, and non-sticky. Hydrophily, water. It is a mode of pollination or transfer of pollen grains through the agency of water. Example: Zostera vallisneria. It is of two types: epihydrophily, in which pollination is occurring on the water surface; hypohydrophily, pollination occurring beneath the water surface. Characteristics: flowers are small and inconspicuous, nectar and odor are absent, stigma is long, sticky, but unwettable. Biotic agencies. Entomophily, insects. The pollen grains are transferred to a mature flower through the agency of insects like moths, butterflies, wasps, bees, beetles, etc. Ornithophily, birds. It is a mode of allogamy performed by birds. Only a few types of birds are specialized for this. They usually are small size and have long beaks. Chiropterophily, bats. It refers to the pollination brought about by bats. Example: Adansonia eperoa falcata. Malacophily, snails. It refers to the pollination brought about by snails and slugs. Example: Alocasia, Lemna, Colocasia. Myrmecophily, ants. It refers to the pollination brought about by ants. Example: Medicago sativa. Pollination. Pollination is the act of transferring pollen grains from the male anther of a flower to the female stigma. The pollination process as an interaction between flowers and pollen vector was first addressed in the 18th century by Christian Conrad Sprengel. One of the ways that plants can produce offspring is by making seeds. Seeds contain the genetic information to produce a new plant. Flowers are the tool that plants use to make the seeds. Once on the stigma, pollen may germinate, which means that a pollen tube forms on the sticky surface of the stigma and grows down into the ovule of the plant. This growth can result in successful fertilization of the flower and the growth of seeds and fruit. Types of pollination: self pollination, cross pollination. Self pollination: the transfer of pollen from anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower or different flower of the same plant is called self pollination. There are two types of self pollination: autogamy. Pollen is transferred to the stigma of the same flower. Geitonogamy. Pollen is transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower on the same flowering plant. Hermaphrodite and monoecious species have the potential for self-pollination. Most of the self-pollinating plants have small, relatively inconspicuous flowers that shed pollen directly onto the stigma, sometimes even before the bud opens. Examples: orchids, Capsula rubella. Cleistogamy. It is a self-pollination that occurs before the flower opens. The pollen is released from the anther within the flower and falls on the stigma of the same flower and grows a tube down the style to the ovules. Some cleistogamous flowers never open, in contrast to chasmogamous flowers that open and are then pollinated. Advantages of self-pollination: parental characters are preserved indefinitely. The flower need not be large. Fragrance and nectar production is not required, which saves considerable nutrient material of plants. Disadvantages of self-pollination: continued self-pollination may lead to weakening of the offspring. Seeds produced will be poor in quality. The defective character of plant cannot be eliminated. Cross-pollination. Cross-pollination is also called heterogamy or allogamy. Type of pollination in which sperm-laden pollen grains are transferred from the flowers of one plant to the flowers of another. Cross-pollination is found in both angiosperms and gymnosperms and facilitates cross-fertilization and outbreeding. Advantages: offsprings are healthier, new varieties may be produced, helps to increase seed production in cereals. Disadvantages: the pollination is not always certain. A large number of pollens are to be produced to ensure chances of pollination. If in crossing a diseased plant gets involved, it will give weak offsprings. Ecological importance: coevolution. Bees provide a good example of the mutualism that exists between hymenopterans and angiosperms. Flowers provide bees with nectar, an energy source, and pollen, a source of protein. When bees go from flower to flower collecting pollen, they are also depositing pollen grains onto the flowers, thus pollinating them. While pollen and nectar in most cases are the most notable reward attained from flowers, bees also visit flowers for other resources such as oil, fragrance, resin, and even waxes. In agriculture, the most essential staple food crops on the planet like wheat, maize, rice, soya beans, and sorghum are wind pollinated or self-pollinated. Improving pollination in areas with suboptimal bee densities. By attracting pollinators like honeybees and increasing their foraging behavior, particularly in the center of large plots, we can increase returns and optimize yield from the plantings.